It is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's panel, Contemporary Design When and Where is Design Criticism, featuring Zesty Meyers, Principal of Art and Company, Alice Twemlow, Chair of the School of Visual Arts, MA Design Research, Writing, and Criticism Program in New York, and Tanner Woodford, Executive Director of the Chicago Design Museum. Today's panel will be moderated by Michael Golec, Associate Professor of Art and Design History in the Department of Art History, Theory, and Criticism at SAIC. Please join me in extending a very warm welcome to all of our panelists. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Stephanie, for that very kind introduction. And my thanks to Zesty and to Alice and to Tanner for, I guess, being ready to answer some questions from me and also from you in the audience. I have a few brief words of introduction and perhaps maybe a little bit more background on our three panelists before we get to the questions. So if you'll bear with me for just a moment. I think in its most general form, design criticism organizes a public or organizes how a public copes with the propagation of various reports on artifacts that are largely made by designers that are distinct from having witnessed their production, appearance, and or use. Design criticism is always a function of distance then, and at times perhaps something like alienation, due to its spatial and temporal ruptures in the connection between designed artifacts and their ongoing reception by ourselves and others. As a practice, design criticism brings closer what is temporally removed, as in the case of historical artifacts, what we could call historical design criticism, and what is spatially removed, as in the case where geographically removed objects are reported on by design critics. In bringing things closer then, design criticism is a mode of reattachment to and reappraisal of our everyday interaction with our worlds. And from a historiographical position, or from the history of design criticism, I think it's possible to consider design criticism moving between two extreme poles, which I hope our panelists will help us explore somewhat today. On the one extreme, we could say there's something like a philosophical design criticism, which is the product of a tension between the cultivation of the critic, or the critical eye, as in me, and also the eye, the sort of discerning perceptual element of the critic, as both authoritative and encourageable, and its potential subordination to something like what we could call the superego of the impositions of the public. To that, how much do publics actually agree with a critical reportage? On the other extreme, we could say is a sociological design criticism, which attends to social, class, or status group specific skill or skills, and the ongoing professionalization of design in the formation of what we would call a designer and her public. And so with that said, allow me to further introduce our panelists. On the very far end is Tanner Woodward, the co-founder and executive director of Chicago Design Museum. Throughout Tanner's career, he's worked as a product designer, a community organizer, interaction designer, and developer. And he's taught and lectured on design issues, history, and rapid ideation in professional and academic settings, including the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. To Tanner's right is Alice Twemlow, is the founding chair of the School of Visual Arts MFA Design Criticism and the SVA MA in Design Research, Writing, and Criticism programs. She currently resides in Amsterdam or thereabouts. Yes, where she is taking on the additional roles there in the Design Academy Eindhoven MA in Design Curating and Writing, and at the Free University Amsterdam MA in Design Cultures. She writes about design for publications including Design Observer, I and the Architect's newspaper, and she's the author of What is Graphic Design For? And has recently contributed essays to Iconic Designs, 50 Stories About 50 Things. And Alice is currently completing a book for MIT Press. Last but not least is Zesty Meyers, who in 1997 founded the gallery R 20th Century, now R and Company, with Evan Snyderman. R and Company has since established itself as one of the most influential design galleries in the world. Through their scholarly researched exhibitions and publications, R and Company has contributed to creating a renewed global interest in collectible design and represents now iconic designers, Werner Patton, Wendell Castle, Greta Magnuson, to name a few. Zesty is currently working on a major overview of 20th century design in Brazil. And so again, let me welcome all of you this afternoon. And I have a couple questions just to start our panelists off. And one of the things I'm most interested to hearing from all of you is, what exactly is design criticism today? What are its manifestations?
Great. I'll jump in. Hello, I'm Tanner. I feel like a total imposter on this stage with these wonderful people who are very brilliant. But I'm excited to be here. So let me put a little bit of context around the Design Museum before I get started. We are in a gallery in Block 37 on State and Washington, right in the middle of the Chicago Loop. And we sort of serve two publics. We serve the general public, and then we serve professional designers, practitioners, that sort of thing. So for me, so we kind of exist in this weird space where we have a bunch of volunteers, 100 to 150 volunteers and board members and really passionate people who are creating and then who are sort of presenting these ideas back to an audience that might not even understand what design is, for example. So for me, design criticism is really answers the question, does it work? If you build something and it works, then it's good design. If you build something and it doesn't work, then it's bad design.
And Tanner, if you would allow me, does the museum as an institution provide the public with a critical perspective on design that is already somehow framing the work that's shown with it answering this question, this worked?
Sort of. So I guess what I mean by that is, when we're thinking about the two audiences we're serving, we're thinking about the plumbers that walk through the space. We're thinking about your grandmother when she comes to the show. We're thinking about the people who are just wandering through a mall and sort of stumble upon this cultural experience and ensuring that our didactics are written in a way that they can understand them. On the other end, we are also writing theses and we're picking objects that sort of ladder up to that thesis and engaging with a curatorial panel and a curatorial advisory board to sort of poke holes in our thought and push us to kind of further the design criticism that we're presenting. So we do have a very sort of academic approach through our exhibitions, but then we make them accessible to a much wider audience.
Sure, I can jump in. Hi, I'm Alice. I have a really positive view of design criticism today. As someone who's actually studied the history of design criticism, I've done that meta thing you were referring to earlier. I think the popular conception is that there once was this golden age of design criticism, right? When there were public intellectuals and we all got together and had a shared discourse and there was sort of, there was a common conversation with common terminologies and a shared language that we could all participate in. Well, I thought that too. But as I began to explore the history of it, I found more and more that it's actually been, as far as I can figure out, always fragmentary and dispersed and a composite activity between the institutions, journalism and academia. That's how it is. So I'm not, I wondered if you were going to bring up the whole death of criticism thing, but I'm glad that's all put aside. And I think we're in an incredibly empowering moment where critics need to be able to perform as reporters, as journalists, as curators very often. I feel we have it's necessary to have a whole range of tools and methods at our disposal and ways of looking at the world. And people are just doing it in really, really interesting ways all over the place, all over the time. yes, it ends up a bit messy. And it's a participatory activity in the sense that when we engage with criticism, we kind of have to figure out our pathways through it. But I see it in a very healthy state today.
The way, in 1997 when we started the gallery, we were in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, before Williamsburg was really popular. And about 1999, we decided we would try to move to Manhattan to have a bigger voice and trying to get people to see exhibitions. And we realized that at this time that nobody was really doing exhibitions about design or showing a collection or anything else. And at this time, everything we were showing was historic. The gallery, still to this day, really starts around 1945, World War II, forward on up to contemporary. So when we moved to Manhattan, the sole goal was we only would move to Manhattan to raise the bar on our world of design, which meant we had to start doing shows and then publishing catalogs, and the dream would then become to do a book or museum shows, etc. And what we learned by when we started to do this and put this out there was why weren't other people, if the secondary market, meaning like at the Christie's or Sotheby's level, these pieces were already selling for such dollar amounts. And the only other example we had to look at, which would be the fine arts market, this wouldn't be allowed. And why was it wrong in our market that no one was writing deeper about these things that were already gaining some kind of value for the right or wrong reasons, good or bad, or anything else? And as we started to grow, we realized that in our world, even today, where is the platform? Or even in New York City today, why isn't the city more together with institutions that have major design collections, with universities that are doing this, and with curators that should be running around to see all these design galleries? Why isn't this gelled together into a bigger picture? So then we decided we would engineer, well, what is a design gallery? And why should it become important? Or why should anyone care? And then we started to find people one at a time that could care. And then in the end, we really don't get reviewed for any of the exhibitions that we put on to this day. Or if we do get reviewed, I get reviewed by an arts writer, because that's the only section in a weekly, in a newspaper like the New York Times or something, that you can read about this. Yes, online we've been reviewed a few times and things like that, but there aren't people coming around to talk about this, not even on a basic level, good or bad, right or wrong, before we get to an intellectualism of why did this person ever make this, or why is it interesting, or why would we show it? And in the end, we stay retail only to create a bigger community, not to do what we need to do. We do it in a way to give back to the people on every level, to build something bigger that's beyond us. And in the gallery, I don't represent my definition of what design is, or if design is now art or anything else, or in between, or craft. I represent, I like to put out the question to the public to create things on all those levels.
This is interesting because I think it raises a question about the relationship between the institution of exhibition, either in a museum or a gallery setting, and the role of the critic as outside of that institution. And historically, and I think you might agree with me, Alice, that design criticism begins with the formation of these collectives or professional groups, the Viennese secessionists or the German Werkbund, where there is the exhibition and the criticism or the critique of design is very closely allied, or was very closely allied. In fact, if there was a fragmentation, it was the movement away from this kind of institutionalization of critique within an exhibition kind of space. And I wonder what role the three of you think the institution of exhibition plays in bringing critics into the conversation, the debates about design, whether it's from a political, social perspective, from a consumer perspective, or from a collector's perspective, and the other way around. To what extent do designers have perhaps maybe an ethical responsibility to work, design critics work with the institutions of exhibition?
Well,
a long question.
I can just jump in with a view on it, which is, I think we're seeing the very shape and texture and notion of the institution, the design, changing right before our eyes. So, it's not, and in really positive ways, as we've had explained here. So I don't think it's massively surprising that you know, the world of reviewing as it exists doesn't really know how to cope with it or understand it, and I don't think we should wait around for them. Quite honestly, I think, you know.
I agree.
Yeah, they're you know, they need things in boxes apparently, and so, you know, that's how it will be. So yeah, I'd like to pick up on Michael's point about this notion of distance, and I think that's what we're constantly negotiating the entire time. The embeddedness or not embeddedness of design criticism within the practice of design, and in this case within its display. And you know, I really think a lot about this. You know, obviously the ideal, right, that's passed down to us from Enlightenment thinking is critical distance. That's what we're all striving for. We need to get perspective on what it is that we are appreciating. Remove ourselves from the, you know, the hustle and bustle of the marketplace, so that we can think pure thoughts somewhere. You know, I don't know where this place exists.
Right
because,
here, right?
Huh?
Right here?
Yeah, right. Right in the hustle. But I think this is much more what it looks like, actually. A critic is in amongst it all, is silly to pretend otherwise, has to make fast decisions and evaluate things, in, you know, almost into the flow, into the current of contemporary culture. Yeah, walking around here is one example. So I really advocate this notion of critical proximity, which is to acknowledge what exists, but also just to embrace it much more. I'm sorry, this is a bit of a long answer, but that's my main point, really. So, which is just that there's this book by Ada Louise Huxtable, which is called Kick to Building lately, right? People probably know it. It's about, she's an architecture critic, or was, and her premise is that you have to get close to a building, close enough to kick it in order to understand it, right? And I think it's the same with design products. You have to get really, really close to them, close, you know, to the market, close to everyone involved, close to the landfill, because that's where everything ends up. And that's what I advocate when I'm teaching my students.
You know, I agree with getting close. You know, so from leaving off with the story, so we moved to Tribeca, and we've done all the things we've said. We have museum shows and big books now, et cetera, and we have a big contemporary program. And we have a global format now of people that are very close to us. They're incredibly close. But the things that we get put up against, which is not what I ever expected, is, well, we find that we're selling to trustees of art departments, not design departments. Maybe there's an older or a younger generation that isn't, that we're now different. We didn't set out to create this. This is what's happened, and this is the community that has accepted us, with us being able to put things out there. So it makes it harder, because then the curators, or if they're can't go to that patron that funds the art department at these institutions to then acquire, even if they want, because they're working with a 1% of the budget of the fine arts department normally in most of these places, if even that. But then on the other critical level, I don't think it exists really in my marketplace for the level and what we're selling and the amount of community that we have. I don't know where to go and how to try to get more of it, or get someone to, I want someone to say it sucks. Just even on the most basic level, just to create a conversation to get to the more of any kind of other intellectual level, or for then me to be able to say, well, we showed this because there was actually a reason, instead of us just trying to sell something. And I think that's a big part of what happens with our world that I would love to see change. I'm stuck with passion as much as I want to have a better life for me and my family next year, or for the artists that are also my family, that are the designers that we represent, and push all of that forward at the same time.
Yeah, I think the other interesting thing about sort of design criticism is the context in which the object is viewed. So you talk about walking up and kicking the building, and you're seeing the building in the context of the rest of the buildings, in the context of the city, in the context of the moment in time that you're kicking the building. If you take the same building and put it in a, let's say, a giant gallery, that totally changes how you see the building. And that's because the curator is allowed to add information or remove information or present certain information in a very concise, clear way. ideally without bias, but not always without bias. And I think that there's sort of, there's not only just that building, but there's also, what was the example? There was a museum I think it was in Houston, that a crane fell through the roof 2 months ago or so. Did you guys hear about this? And a bunch of the patrons that were in the gallery sat around and looked at it because they thought it was an art piece. But in reality, they were in danger. And I think that's a really interesting example of how a gallery can make somebody see the world in a completely different way. So you have to think about sort of how an object is being criticized. Is it being criticized at the moment that it's in the landfill, which to me is, I think, as important as the moment that it's in the gallery? And how are we looking at that critically throughout not just the life cycle of the object or the idea or the process, but also of the person that's showing it?
Well, the short answer is we don't, unfortunately. We don't look at the object through its entire life cycle. We're fixated on the moment of its newness, of its arrival. It's dropping from some kind of, heaven of perfection, and I would say still while it's on a plinth, in its perfection, we rarely consider objects as they're used by people, and then we even more rarely than that consider them when they're disposed of, and how they're disposed of, and how the systems, are created to enable that, and what that means. So that's where we have the work to do, I think, as design critics, absolutely. And I think, museum shows and exhibitions do a great job of introducing those ideas, or could do more with that. So it's a combined enterprise, but I think that's very problematic on our part.
We presently have a show up that's entitled Difficult. And it's a show that goes back and starts in the 1930s with the Garrett Riefeld zigzag chair, and we actually have one from the 30s that we're showing in the show, and it's actually, oddly enough, for sale. But what we wanted to show is that, and it's next to a Gaetano Pesce vase that's very soft and flexible, and then it's next to Ron Arad's basically student work, which was his rover chair. And what we wanted to do in this exhibition is show that most of the pieces that we're showing at one point in time were made fun of, weren't acceptable. They broke tradition in the sense of, like, design is something that you sit on and that was it. And when Garrett Riefeld created a zigzag chair, it must have been so revolutionary that today we look at it, oh, it's just a zigzag. But it was really that important in what happened. And then we asked people from the community, or we looked back and took quotes from magazines, newspapers at the time about the problems or how bad it was. And we've blown them up giant scale and put them on the wall to try to get people to read that this was actually happening 70, 80 years ago. The show stops with the Pesce work probably from about 5 or 10 years ago on up almost to today. And the importance is with the show, and then we've had fine artists such as Tom Sachs comment, and like Gaetano Pesce writes his own thing, of course, since he's still alive. But people now have read, and then all of a sudden the people that have come in the gallery, instead of just to consume the object, are now thinking, and then they're starting to talk to us in a different way because they read the 3 sentences that were blown up giant. But then downstairs in our gallery, we have a contemporary design show, which I think is even on a man named Thaddeus Wolfe, which I think is that much more important, because by showing the past, then this is what allowed the young person downstairs to be able to be showed today. And even keeping it that simple. But how do you get people to start to talk more about, oh, that chair is important. Oh, an Eames chair was once not accepted, or a Werner Panton piece, or et cetera. And then how do I don't think people think like this because it's hit popular culture.
Alice, it seems to me that you, of our 3 panelists, are most involved in encouraging your students to take up what I think Zesty is a kind of challenge. How do we get a more robust discourse on design criticism? You're in charge in various degrees of in effect, for lack of a better term, training young people to take up this challenge. What are the things that you talk to them about in terms of encouraging them?
Well, I'm taking Zesty's challenge to heart for sure, but there are very few design criticism shaped spaces in the real estate market. Not the real estate market, what am I saying? The real estate of journalism, basically. If you count all the column inches and stuff and all of that, I mean, we've got Alice Rawshorn as a, who is actually labelled a design critic, and with a column that is labelled as such. But beyond that, there's very few spots. So I tend to just put the onus, on the students themselves to create these opportunities. And I think, looking at your situation, Zesty, we would say, well, you've got it all going there. You've provoked the debate. You've got members of the public coming in. You have a forum in the form of the gallery in which the discourse is taking place, and it can be spun out in any number of ways from that. But the thing you're missing, by the sounds of it, is a more traditional form of criticism, in the sense of a measured response that's written down and enters the public record. Is that what you're basically saying?
In printed matter, it's great to be an Architectural Digest or the Elle Discourse, but it's just pretty in the end. It doesn't talk about anything, or it basically says this wealthy person bought this thing, but it doesn't give the content that there might actually be something more. And those magazines don't have a platform to allow that in. They don't even really have a platform to champion the young contemporary person, to write about why they're interested in this platform of design. So then where do you go if it's based on the old? Because that's sort of a 20th century idea. So where's the 21st century idea going to come from to finish creating this? So there's a good story about the art world, and I've never tried to factualize it. But during the last recession, back in the late 80s, early 90s, a reporter from the New York Times supposedly goes to Soho, where all the art galleries were. And then a day or two later, she writes a scathing article that all the art dealers are desperate to give away the stuff. Everything's 50% off, right? And the art dealers end up getting mad at the New York Times, supposedly. And this is when they complain and create and say, like, well, we do all this for reasons. And back in the 1980s or early 90s, it was a luxury to be an art dealer, as I could say. It's a luxury to be a design dealer. There wasn't 1,000 art galleries in New York. Maybe there was 100, maybe, at the time. And then at that point in time, this is what creates the Friday section where the reviews come from, supposedly, was that the dealers got mad and said, we need a voice. And so what my hope is, as much as I have a platform as this, is that your students will come and want to champion this and create a platform to put this out there. Not that I'm going to like what I read also, and hopefully I will, but that this will actually, but I want it to go both ways that way.
But I think what I'm saying is, what I'm doing with the students is, it's partly philosophical, but it's partly practical, is that, we're not just dealing with writing. That's just one of the media we use. And I spend a lot of time with them working out what their arguments are. We do incredible amounts of research and reporting and history, and then the trick is to figure out, who is your public? How do we gather that public, and how do we communicate with them? What's the best vehicle? Writing's not always the way. Is it an information graphic? Is it an audio tour? Is it and we've done so many things, a museum in the wild? Is it an ice cream truck we need to bring around with our message, distributing manifestos? Whatever. We've done many different media. So I may be slightly guilty and responsible of redirecting attention away from that absence of that column.
I don't think it has to exist in a traditional format. I just want it. I think there's a huge momentum happening for why design in the 21st century, or what is the difference going to be between fine art and design, or anything that's now creative or cultural, or what Nikki and Simon were saying for the last talk about people can make anything now if you can get to YouTube or read, or find out technology, right? And if it's really that simple, then how do the young do it with all the points you just made to create a future of what it could become?
I think it might actually be better if it's in a non-traditional format. And that's one of the things that we're sort of thinking about in our space, is that it's the trip over factor. It's you're going to Zara and you trip over a design museum and then you learn something about the context of why Detroit is how it is, for example. I think that's not necessarily a new idea. The Container Corporation, I'm a huge fan of, and they did a campaign called Great Ideas of Western Man, which I'm sure several of you are aware of. For, was it 50 years? They ran this campaign where they interacted with artists and designers, and they would share a quote with them, and the artists and designers would react to the quote and make something, ship it to Chicago, and then they would photograph the piece, turn it into an advertisement, and then run it in the New Yorker. And again, that's still the print medium, but the idea was that it was coming from this unexpected sort of entity and was creating this sort of critical design, or this critical cultural dialogue through design, not even design dialogue necessarily. I think that when you sort of wander into these critical moments without expecting them, it has a much deeper impact.
Is one of the issues, this had just occurred to me as you were talking, that there's conventionally, I could say in the United States, design has largely been associated with a corporate enterprise in many ways, whether it's the Eames producing works for Herman Miller or some other example. IBM had an exhibition space at their headquarters in Manhattan, and largely these large corporations were, as part of their publicity or marketing strategies, used exhibitions as a way to invite a public into their work. Have those issues changed? Are we talking about design in a very different way now than might have been the case mid-century and after? Are we still unsure of what we're talking about when we say design, and therefore a discourse that could find its way into criticism could evolve?
Yeah, I mean, you had a yes from your audience. I mean, yeah, it's.
I have to say, I'm still trying to draw the line between where and when to apply design criticism. You're both splitting hairs. Well, we've got the artist and the designer. Okay, what makes an artist and a designer? Vice versa. I mean, is the designer the one who did the pot and the artist put the flowers on the pot? Or
Well, I'm gonna.
I have an answer to that. You know, the vase should really disappear, and you should only ever see the flowers if it's a good vase.
That's a good answer. I hope we don't have to do that debate right now. So let's sidestepping that one and coming back to this issue of design. What is design today, and how might we deal with it in an exhibition context or as critics? Yes, it is. It's beyond amorphous, isn't it? I mean, thinking of, I've been working with my students all week developing their thesis concepts. And I do a thing where I have them write about do some speed writing to get them into it, about one of the objects of their inquiry. Not a single person in the room had an actual object that they were going to write about or talk about. None of them considered design. I mean, I was quite shocked. I was like, normally we have at least a couple who still consider design products to be, important and part of design. It is all about representation. It is about code. It is about, as I was talking about before, the destruction and the disposal of objects. It is pretty much everything else but the object itself. At the moment, which I think presents a fascinating challenge for a design museum, which was ostensibly founded on the idea of the aura of the object, and how to gather objects for the contemplation by the public. Now I think what we're doing is we're gathering ideas, aren't we, in those spaces?
We actually ran into that head on in our last exhibition. We had about 15 objects, 15 ideas represented, and only one original object. It was a coat that was made. Everything else was an idea that needed form, so we got together groups of volunteers and groups of designers and curators and practitioners and had them create objects that would represent the form or try to represent the space that we were talking about in some way to lead up to the narrative. And at the end of the show, the deinstallation was the easiest I've ever done because nothing was precious. It was all just ideas and didactics that then went into drawers, that sort of thing. It's a really good.
And I also think that perhaps when we're talking about design criticism, anyone that has studied design in an academic or design school setting is familiar with the kind of design criticism that is prescriptive, that tells us either what is wrong with design and what, in a kind of manifesto-like articulation, tells us what design should be, or from another manifesto standpoint, would argue that there is an ideal for design that designers should be striving for. And that kind of design criticism is less focused on consumption, but almost exclusively on production, while consumption is an end, it might be an end result, a more utopian sort of life through better design. We're all familiar with those kinds of design critique kind of tropes. Adolf Loos's ornament is crime, that sort of thing. Has that sort of mode of design criticism slipped away at the same time? The sort of prescriptive, I have an idea of an ideal life, and this is how design can contribute to it?
Yeah, I think postmodernism happened, and yeah.
But now it's postmodernism,
well, yeah.
so maybe.
I think, we study manifestos, and there is an incredible resurgence of them at the moment, which is really interesting. But when you start to actually look a little closer at what they are, very few of them, I think, probably stand up to the criteria we might hold as, being a manifesto. They're more often expressions of personal philosophy or a few ideas I had on my way to the studio this morning, kind of thing. The kind of cultural context in which Adolf Loos wrote Ornament and Crime in 1908, I can't see us being able to replicate at this point. And I think I personally think it's a medium that existed in a very particular set of kind of social and political and economic constraints. So, but that's not to say design critics don't have beliefs, and of course they should be expressing those. That's all part of it. It very much depends on personality, I have to say. Not everyone is prepared to put themselves out there in that way. I think at a base level, it's more to do with what you talked about in your introductory notes, this idea of design criticism being an intensification of objects. I really like that phrase you use. I think that sums up a lot of what it is we're doing, more so than the prescriptive kind of moralizing.
Well, that would be the second part of the question. To what extent does design, and you mentioned, Alice, proximity. When I had been speaking of distance, I was thinking in a very literal sense, not in a kind of philosophical, critical sense, but the idea that the critic supplies a sort of report on an encounter, and that encounter is distributed through print or some other means, but that distance is bridged through the voice of the designer, the design critic, where a potential consumer or potential figure who might experience that object doesn't have the opportunity because they're not in the same location. But proximity, that is, design criticism becomes a report on proximity, or a means to bridge some kind of gap in that way.
But what about with the context of social media and the reach, that I have now with my gallery, is that the majority of people that see us through social media will never come to my gallery. It's absolutely an incredible thing to see where people are coming from, or how I can't always find how they get to us or what they can say, or if we do put something on an Instagram, they can write whatever comment they want about whatever we put up. So then now they're adding to the critique of, yeah.
I would say, this is exactly at the very crux of what we could understand as the history of criticism, of people being very distant from the objects, but having some encounter through writing or through Instagram or some other form. Instagram could be a form of design criticism. I wouldn't be surprised if your students have investigated this. But it is a compendium of critical perspective that's brought to a public that may never visit your gallery. And that Instagram page functions as a kind of design critical apparatus. Again, the way of sort of reporting on something that's at a physical distance, something that I can never experience. This is Diderot's criticism to a T in the 18th century. So it seems that maybe we're returning to something of a moment of criticism's past in order to contend with the nature of design today.
I think it's really interesting too. Okay. To think about sort of the value of the criticism. So if it's criticism in the context of a design journal, where you're looking at an object, you're speaking to like-minded people. You're speaking to people who would be sort of seeking out this criticism, who would be looking for, who would disagree with that, would be on the same sort of academic level. And then you have your Instagram feed, where you've got your buddies, and your buddies are leaving comments about whether or not they like, the form or the color or the shape or the idea. And for me, I think about your friends' friends. Sort of that level of criticism is much more widely accepted, even though it might be less sort of academic, because that comes from somebody that they trust. So it comes from a like-minded audience, and it makes me start to wonder sort of what the role is of kind of academic design criticism versus sort of functional design criticism versus all sorts of, it's all design criticism, but citizen design criticism, exactly, citizens' plans, that kind of thing. And I don't know if, clearly, I have an opinion on which one's good and which one's bad, but it's kind of an interesting thought.
Well, I think one of the values and the purposes of it is not so much to feed just straight back into that production mode that you were referencing before, and in this sort of dialogue with a designer. It's also to work with people who are using design every day, and help them understand or re-understand what it is they're engaging with. And that's why I would say, just to come back to your point that about this distance thing, is that there are very few designed objects today that someone doesn't have access to. I mean, you're talking about a very rarefied set, I think, that might be unique objects tied to a particular place. Most people have, the things we're talking about right around them. And the job of the critic then is almost to create more distance, to defamiliarize those objects and help us begin to see them in fresh ways and with new readings that help, them extract the meaning. So distance is absolutely at the core of everything that we're doing here. It's just, I think we negotiate it all differently.
And I think that's... We'll let you finish. Sounds good.
I also think that, if we went back 100, 110 years ago and looked at what defined the taste of a millionaire, I think it's really going to come out of the decorative arts and what they wanted and how that went through the last century to get to the future. So now that we said from the quote from what you did about how everyone has access now, big business still has to do it in the same way. They have to hire design people to get their product out there to make it acceptable to a public, because they can't inherently do it themselves from how they've set up their structure. But the same thing happens with what we do, with what we really sell are mostly unique experiences that most of the time don't get seen if it's a commission. And that commission that the designer that's working with today is no different than the artisan that built the mansions in Newport 100 years ago. It is the same thing today, because the only people that get access to it are the people that are invited in, unless it becomes like an Elizabeth Stewart Gardner type mansion later on that gets given to the public. And that's how I think the century for this part of design is going to break down as well. Or taste.
Well, I hope we have some questions from our audience.
We have a microphone as well.
Just to build on a couple of points that you've all been making. If you go back 100 years, theater critique, art critique came from Kansas City. It came from Seattle. It came from Birmingham and Manchester. And the democratization of criticism, has sort of taken a downward spiral. So now it's just London, it's just Paris, it's New York. Oh, and it's Chicago, yay. But how do we get back to the time when anyone can critique art or design in a meaningful way and we all listen to it?
I think that's a fantastic question. I often say I think 85% of my clientele cares. They're really vested in what they buy from us. They love what they have for these reasons. And the other 15% come along because an art advisor or decorator or whatever has bought it from them. And I think I have that discourse with my client. I would like to find a way to create that more publicly, in a sense of what, even like I said, just on the base value of good, bad, right, wrong, happy, sad, just to get anything rolling like that, I think would be amazing.
it's an unusual argument to hear because you normally hear the opposite, which is just that design criticism has become incredibly democratized since the rise of social media, and even before that with blogging. I mean, that's what most people point to and blame for the, eroding of this perfect state that I mentioned before that we once thought existed. And it's led to the disappearance of so many architecture columns and whatever few design coverage there was in newspapers. So I think, someone might sit up here and argue it is too democratic. There are too many voices. It's too much of a mess. It's too fragmented. There is no single conversation. But I don't think that's what this guy meant. So I'm sort of enjoying the state that it's in. Like I said, I think there's stuff rising up and bubbling up from this, from the way we have access to so many different tools to communicate.
I think that's an interesting point. I wonder if the way to sort of find the middle ground is to involve the community in the making, so that there's more sort of awareness of sort of how the idea is being either presented in a gallery or consumed in any other context, but to really kind of involve as many people as possible in both the creation and the criticism at a local community level, and then to use an opportunity to broadcast that either online or in print or that sort of thing.
That's the exciting stuff.
But I think that's actually happening, and I think the revolution is food.
Yeah, you're right.
That is the revolution we're in. It's not music, it's not fine art, it's food, and what's happened to food in the last 15 years or around globally now is incredible, which then would get into what do you eat your food from if now it's farm to table? And then what do you drink it out of, and what do you read when you go to relax after you're having your aperitif that was grown on the farm?
So we'll use food.
Yeah. I think food should be the catalyst for this. But I also think the world is at a place where, growing out of more of the decorative arts of the tradition of Europe, since we're now a global, real marketplace, and my clientele comes from everywhere, I also think what's happened is most of the world understands things that were actually made for them or were handmade. And the idea of something handmade, or the idea of how the talk before this about ceramics or craft being entered into a fine arts market, which I think is sort of a weird discussion that it's just a material and these people wanted to use it and it could be that simple. But I think the world is looking for something like this instead of things that are just so controlled, to create that farm to table sort of experience for them, and that everybody could become their own sort of critic or vote in what's right or good now as well. With the social media aspect, I think is the other part of the revolution that is happening, and I agree that the momentum is fierce and it's great. And I just don't want to get interviewed by another person from a magazine that says, why does this sell for $10,000? Because I know it's not going to be the conversation that I want to have with them.
Hi, thanks for bringing this important conversation here today. My question is, you've talked quite a lot about the relationship of art and design and the role of criticism in the art world. I guess I'd love you to talk a little bit about what we might learn from the world of architecture. It seems like the professional critic and the amateur critic, criticism is alive and well in the world of architecture, which perhaps is closer to design than art is. So I'm wondering, what can we learn from the world of architecture to bring the sort of the criticism to the fore for the world of design?
Yeah, I do look. I'm in amongst the world of architecture criticism, and it is encouraging. You're right. I think in the instance of New York with the New York Times, the way architecture is discussed by Michael Kimmelman, prominently, the way he's turned the conversation away from the examination of buildings to considering, architecture as the design of our man-made environment brings, and how human beings interact with that. It's a radical shift for the New York Times and many other organizations. And through doing that, it's inspiring for design. There's a place for design within all of that discussion. So I'm very encouraged by that. But yeah, I mean, I see design on a par as architecture in the amount of new museums and organizations and pop-up magazines and just all the energy surrounding the fragmented discourse. Yeah, I rarely look at the art world, so I don't have anything to say about that. I'm always in amongst design and architecture mainly. So you guys should have.
You know, I with a lot of what we do today, it starts more with the Starchitect in the sense of what they've created, and I think that's the proper term, and then the art collection, and then the interior designer, and then what we sort of do comes in to play with this, which is like this other ground, or maybe where the thing that ties it all together now with the importance of what this other bigger structure is. And I think it's something sort of new of how, if you looked at traditional design, what happened to the world of design and how it faded away into the 90s in America particularly, or also in Europe, and where most of the designers that were popular after the war then had to sell out to become corporate. And then it went downhill, and now it's come back to this individualism of what's happening. I think is a great thing. I don't know if I'm the best one to answer about the idea of just with the architect, but I think the inclusion or the idea of being the interior architect is something we take on as a role, which is just important as the skin or the functionality of the interior of these places, of what we try to accomplish to make a better way for whoever that's using it or to live in it to actually be.
Yeah, I think it's a really smart observation, HM. So when I think of design, the first thing I think of is graphic design. I was trained as a graphic designer, and that's where I understand form sort of the best in that context. And those are the first 3 or 4 shows that we did as a design museum. And often when I think about criticism, I actually don't really think about art criticism either. My art criticism stops at walking into the MCA and just sort of understanding what's going on in the gallery. I don't think much deeper than that about it, but I do think very heavily about sort of design criticism and the process of creation through design. And I think that architecture is much closer than art in that way. So I guess I don't really have anything to say except for I agree in a very long way.
But I think it's interesting that graphic design has a fairly robust kind of critical discourse, or at least, you know, I'm not sure how we feel about it right now, but certainly in very recent history it has. Much more than product design. Oh yeah, I mean, and I always wonder about that. I'm like, is it because graphic design deals with the written word? You know, is that something to do with it? I couldn't ever figure out. But a lot of that's come from America. You know, that's where the kind of the blossoming of that discourse in the 1990s from a few institutions has had, you know, significant repercussions. It's really interesting.
Yeah, you'll find Stephen Heller in the New York Times along with Kimmelman.
The extent of my sort of understanding of design criticism in the product design world is Amazon reviews.
I love Amazon product reviews. I'm so glad that came up. This is such a resource. And I was sort of thinking about it when you were talking, Zesty, about the lack of the, you know, the kind of the review. If you dig this stuff out, man, it's all there. People are engaging with design on a day-to-day basis in a thoughtful, not always thoughtful, sometimes thoughtful, often hilarious way. It's a new art form. And it's not just Amazon product reviews. There are Yelp reviews of, service stations, prison cells. I mean, like, incredibly, these kind of the way these bodies of literature are kind of amassing around our design environment. That's where we should be looking.
A rich archive, no doubt, yeah.
Do you contribute?
Sorry?
Do you contribute?
No, I'm a sort of weird voyeur.
Yeah.
I watch it and with excitement, yeah.
We have time for one more short question.
Thank you. When I went to School of the Art Institute in the early 70s, graduated 74 as a BFA, I sat in on a master's class by James Sterling Ostler called Aesthetics. And one of the books he would refer to us was a little quarterly magazine called the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism. And I was wondering if you could substitute that, and if you would write a journal of aesthetics and design criticism.
Okay, I'm on it. There is actually, in the Encyclopedia of Aesthetics, there has recently been several new contributions on design, specifically graphic design as well as product design. My sense is that the world of scholarship in relationship to aesthetics will start to explore design in the way that it has explored architecture and art. And part of this has to do, I think, with Michael Kelly, who's the editor of this enormous project, is being very inclusive in terms of what counts for philosophical aesthetic study. And so this is the second or third edition of the encyclopedia, and it has the inclusion of design, and that will continue to grow. So I think it's already there. Whether or not the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism will pick up on this, I think, is yet to be determined. But my sense is it will be. There will be students who will look to the encyclopedia for those entries, and they'll see their way to exploring design from that perspective.
Thank you all so much. Sorry, we're at time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.